To assume a critical stance, a practice may follow one of two distinct trajectories. The first, and the more prevalent, is overarching in its application. It entails a critical stance on an entrenched theory or practice that is equally overarching, for instance, modernism, postmodernism, post-critical, and so on. In contrast, the second approach is delimited in scope. Rather than asking what patent theory should a critical approach embrace, it is focused on culture-specific building types and asks what arcane theory does each building type historically hide under the rubrics of function or practical requirements. To what metaphysics, it asks, does each type give the aura of physics? The aim of this critical trajectory is not to facilitate the displacement of one ideology with another, but to expose and resist the authoritative claims of any ideology to truth through the complacent agency of a building type. Exploring the second path to a critical practice, this presentation focuses on the art museum as a case study. The art museum as we know it is barely over 200 years old. It dates back to the creation of the Museum of the Republic at the Louvre in 1793. Here, the public assumed, then redefined and thoroughly reorganized a private practice that traces its history back to the onset of the Renaissance, but not much before. The practice of collecting art objects, public or private, presupposes their designation as collectibles. The history of this classification, recent and Western as it is not patently different in duration from the history of art itself, and it is not all too clear which classification came first. The Middle Ages, Marlowe reminded us long ago, I quote, were as unaware of what we mean by the word art as were Greece and Egypt, who had no word for it. What we understand by art was the invention of the Renaissance, or rather of a people who over time began to see in the Virgin a statue, and in the classical statue not a heathen idol, but the embodiment of a universal ideal, the beautiful. The transformation of the cult referent into a subject had distinct spatial ramifications. As cult objects, paintings and statues were meant to establish a visual link between the viewer and the cult referent. They were meant to be seen, not looked at. As works of art, paintings and statues had to retain a distance from both the viewer and the place they happened to occupy. As cult objects, paintings and statues collapsed space. As art objects, they imposed it. Once classified as art, that is, separated and distanced from their place, paintings and statues were relocated to a new place, the repositories that in various forms were popular among European ruling elite in the 17th and 18th centuries. These would develop into two distinct realms, the cabinet and the gallery. The gallery, often a long rectangular room, served as a repository for paintings and statues, gathered there for their aesthetic and iconographic value. The cabinet, on the other hand, was a designated place wherein, as Francis Bacon put it, and I quote, whatsoever the hand of man by exquisite art or engine has made rare in stuff, form, or motion, whatsoever singularity, chance, and the shuffle of things had produced, shall be sorted and included. The bafflingly heterogeneous body of objects encountered in these cabinets appears to have one thing in common. They were unique productions, not necessarily in origin, but where they were collected in the one place, outside of which they had no immediate place. Paintings and statues were included in the cabinet of curiosities on account of neither their aesthetic value nor monetary value. They were included on account of their singularity where they happened to be, that is, their authenticity and historicity. The desire to collect curiosities in one place raises, of course, the question of motive. Why this preoccupation with the spatial control of the singular and the authentic? To postulate an answer, we need to follow the development of the cabinet into the museum. The question of how to house art and how to shape its place once it entered the public realm were addressed in the last quarter of the 18th century, first in France and later in Germany. Conceptually and experientially, the library was the model for the early proposals. This was based in part on a valuation of art that was deeply rooted in the cabinet, that is, viewing art as a rare and unique document, and not necessarily or primarily as an aesthetic object. In the final count, however, the design of the museum would follow a different trajectory. The Decisive Period was the second decade of the 19th century. The developing counter-argument to the then prevalent conception of the art museum as a place for instruction was effectively summarized by Leo von Klenz in 1816, arguing, and I quote, "Museum is not a place for artist training, but a place in which to show a number of treasures of art to all kinds of visitors in a manner to be worthy of the objects and to create pleasure in them." Schinkel and Wagner later rephrased this sentiment as, I quote, "First delight, then instruct." Despite clear differences, all parties to the early debate over the museum's purpose fully realized that any given perception of art is to a considerable measure spatially construed. The contention in the debate was whether to spatially construe and render art an object of study or an aesthetic object primarily. All parties also agreed on the chronological organization of art in place of iconographic organization. However, the chronological organization presented a unique dilemma to both parties. Every chronologically organized collection is bound to have, I quote, "true and significant gaps," as von Humboldt noted with regret in 1829. To alleviate the problem, Alois Hirt had hoped to use casts to complete the historic sequence in the Berlin collection, and later Humboldt suggested the purchase of copies to fill the gaps in the painting collection. Von Romer was quick to remind everyone, however, that, I quote, "all the value of a painting turns around the idea of originality." The purchase of copies was out of the question, and ever since, the art museum has been, like the cabinet before it, a place adamantly exclusive of the copy. Despite appeals for a public museum going back to 1797, it was not until 1822 that Schinkel was asked to submit a design for an art museum attached to the Berlin Academy. Schinkel's initial design for 4 enveloping arms around the central courtyard was in the spirit of earlier French speculative museum designs. In the subsequent 3 years, a number of significant changes to the initial plan were to radically alter the shape of the museum and along with it the experience of art in the public realm. The first departure occurred on January 7, 1823, when Schinkel made the unsolicited proposal to separate the museum from the Academy building and move it away from the center of town to a new site opposite the Royal Palace on an island in the Spree River. This was the first of a series of spatial and formal manipulations that were to create a highly ritualized path to the resting place of art. Schinkel's vision for the place where delight was to come before instruction consisted of a freestanding rectangular building raised on a high podium. Reaching it required venture on a journey that was, if not deliberately arduous, it was meticulously elaborate. The ritual procession out to the new place for art required one to leave the dense city fabric behind, cross the river on a bridge, enter the large open plaza of the island, and on transverse axes cross the immense void of the plaza, terminated by the ceremonial staircase and the long monumental colonnade behind which the main body of the museum was carefully withdrawn. This was to be the legacy of the Altes Museum. It transformed the conceptual distinction between art and non-art on the one hand, and the authentic and the inauthentic on the other, into a spatial experience of separation and disjointment played out at the conceptual edge of the city. It created a place for and located the aesthetic and the authentic on the outside, separated from the city by a deliberate journey. The carefully orchestrated experience of disjointment from the city as the place of habitation to the museum as the place of visitation was significantly enhanced by 4 major modifications to the initial design proposal between 1825 and 1828. The last and the most elaborate modification was to the design of the plaza bordered by the palace and the museum. Schinkel had initially conceived of the plaza as a unified space connecting the palace, the church, and the museum together into, as he put it, a regulated whole. Wilhelm III rejected the proposal in favor of a scheme that disjoined the museum from the palace and turned the plaza into a ceremonial path across layers of space to the museum. In turn, the suppression of the rotunda dome in the final proposal shifted the visual focus of the visitor in the plaza from a focal point in the background to the foreground colonnade and the backward layering of the compositional elements along the path. In the same way, turning the vestibule staircase behind the colonnade 180 degrees to no advantage other than its visual impact radically changed the perception of the vestibule from a multi-directional space to a unidirectional path through the imposing mass of the staircase. This was further reinforced by changing the staircase in front of the colonnade to a unidirectional path that confronted the colonnade directly and reinforced the lattice depth as the imposing threshold it was meant to be. What these changes clearly indicate is that the journey of disjointment past the multiplicity of thresholds imposed in front of the galleries was carefully contemplated and deliberate in the minute. Deferring for the moment the question of why the enjoyment and appreciation of authentic art should have the ritual of spacing as a precondition, it is important to note that the logic of spacing that saw its first expression in Altus Museum has since informed and characterized the Art Museum as a new and unique building type. The manifestations of this logic have been diverse and particular to each context. They have been as dramatic and elaborate as the Philadelphia Art Museum, or as minimal and subtle as the Whitney Museum. Among the more celebrated recent examples, one can readily ones that readily come to mind are the Staatsgalerie in Stuttgart, the High Museum of Art in Atlanta, the Getty Museum in Los Angeles, the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia, and of course the Louvre, that was not designed as a museum and belatedly turned into a proper museum by sealing off the exterior walls and monumental doorways and the portals of the old palace and redirecting everyone through the forecourt to the pyramidal glass entry, dramatically separating the world above from the world below the ground plane. Much as compliance with the museum's ground rules is expected, deviation from the norm are severely criticized and condemned. The failures are in this respect as instructive as the success stories. Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim Museum is a case in point. Criticized from inception as an unsuitable place for art, Guggenheim fails on crucial counts. It fails to distance itself from the fabric of the city, and thereafter it fails to simulate the experience of another distinct and separate world for art behind its facade. In compensation for the missing distance, Guggenheim critics, including Ada Louise Huxtable, wished they had been moved, I quote, out of the city or, I quote, relocated across the street in Central Park, where the Metropolitan Museum is located at a visible distance from the city fabric. So far, I've tried to outline a deliberate and persistent logic to the design of the Art Museum from inception. The lingering question is, of course, why the persistent spacing and the disjointment of art over the course of the Art Museum's history. Historically, the relationship of Western culture to painting alongside writing and other forms of graphic representation has been, in the least, an ambivalent relationship. Conceived at the advent of an unwanted absence, according to a pervasive myth that ascribes the invention of painting to a Corinthian youth, the site of painting from its presumed inception has been the site of a desired presence that it cannot judiciously fill. As such, painting has been, Jacques Derrida reminded us long ago, the subject of simultaneous condemnation and praise for its ability to duplicate and perpetually conjure an absent or else invisible referent. Prescribed or proscribed as a mimetic device that substitutes memory for perception, painting has been persistently deemed to follow and fall short of the presence it conjures in absence. This was not to change with the transformation of painting into art. The referent merely gave way to a subject that retained all the privileges of the former vis-a-vis the painted image. This presumed alterity of representation as contingent, secondary, and referential vis-a-vis the real as the non-contingent and the self-referential has been maintained and perpetuated in turn with a host of distinct ritual practices and institutions. Of these, the Art Museum, invented as it was at a particular point in time, is an indispensable element. The Art Museum as an institution and a building type, along with the institutions and practices it supplanted, are indispensable to Western culture and its logocentric determination, because this determination is, as any, a fragile and volatile determination. The real, construed as it is in the West, to appear as the non-contingent other of representation, faces a constant challenge to its authority as a self-referential or non-representational inevitability, from the contingent representational other. Consequently, the intermingling of reality and representation in the West has been deemed a fatal affair. John Ruskin's encounter with the fatal cohabitation of the real and the copy, which takes place, interestingly enough, on the steps of the British Museum, is a telling example. Discussing, I quote, the utterly base and inadmissible practice of painting of surfaces to represent some other material, Ruskin writes, and I quote, I've made it a rule in the present work not to blame specifically, but I may perhaps be permitted, while I express my sincere admiration of the very noble entrance and general architecture of the British Museum, to express also my regret that the noble granite foundation of the staircase should be marked at its landing by an imitation, the more blamable because tolerably successful. The only effect of it is to cast suspicion upon the true stones below and upon every bit of granite afterwards encountered. End of quote. What forces Ruskin to voice an uncharacteristic blame is the undemarcated presence of the real and the copy, or the self-referential and the representational, in the same space. He directs his blame at the imitative representation, not for being a bad representation, but for being, I quote, tolerably successful. He condemns it not because it deceives or hides anything from him, but because it reveals too much of itself and, in effect, too much about its presumed non-contingent other. The successful mock loosens Ruskin's grip on the reality of the real. It casts suspicion on the authenticity of the original. What distinguishes for Ruskin the reality of the real from its mere representation is an original and causal link between the appearance and the substance of the real. What Ruskin loses in the company of the mock is this link. What he loses is the presumed dependence in real presence of appearance on being. If the real stone could become suspect in the company of its mock, if its stone appearance could be taken for an imitation in this company, then this appearance must necessarily have nothing to do with the real presence of a stone, or else suspicion as much as imitation would not be possible. What the effect of this successful mock indicates, what in effect is the condition of its possibility, and at that the possibility of repetition, imitation, or representation, is the independence of representation from the presence or absence of the signified referent in reality as it is in representation. What it indicates is that real presence is itself a representation, that only as a representation can real presence ever be subject to suspicion. Reality offers no greater hold on its appearance and no greater link to its substance than the mock. Considering that it is the cohabitation of the real and the mock, and not the individual appearance of either, that threatens our grip on appearance, Ruskin recommends we contain the effect of the mock by framing and separating it from the real. The framing can be either conceptual or literal. What is imperative, Ruskin tells us, is to either conceptually distance the copy by making its appearance fall noticeably short of the real, and as such inexchangeable with it, or else to literally distance the copy by framing it. Ruskin's recommended spacing is, of course, a widespread and time-honored practice. Our encounters with the contingent representation in the wider cultural realm are perpetually mediated, carefully controlled, and spatially segregated. The Art Museum is just one example. If the question of art's place and placement has loomed large since the inception of painting and sculpture as art, it is in no small measure a reflection of the problematically undifferentiated and undifferentiable space of contingent representation. It is because art has no outside, since outside every presumed or presumable place for representation, one finds only more representation. This is precisely what Ruskin's successful mock forcefully and problematically brought to surface. To curtail the ever-looming danger of exposure and displacement in the company of art, it is essential, as Ruskin suggests, to put in place, institutionally and literally, what art defies and denies conceptually, that is, a sense of place, or in other words, of boundaries and outer limits. The fabrication of the museum as an other space is, persistent as it has been, a cultural substitute for what is missing and missed, and outside to the contingent representation. Within the confines of the picture frame provisionally, and within the confines of the museum permanently, art assumes an outside. The exercise the art museum implements architecturally is a twofold practice. On the one hand, the art museum as an institution and a building type exiles the inherent representational characteristics of the real in the name of mimesis and art to the museum. In turn, it curtails the inherent reproducibility that is art in the name of authenticity through the exclusion of the mark. In the world outside the museum, the copy may thereby proliferate without undermining the authority of the real because its face is turned toward the authentic in that other place where the copy has no place by design. What makes room for the docile cohabitation of the real and the reproduction is the designated and exclusive place of the authentic on the outside. The copy poses no apparent threat so long as it is in reference to another reality at the end of a journey in an other place. That is, so long as its origin is on the outside. The museum is, in other words, the indispensable reserve to the economy that regulates the widespread and free circulation of contingent images outside the museum. Returning to the initial question of a critical practice, the issue for such a practice is not how to facilitate through complacency, or for that matter opposition, the metaphysics that informs the art museum. Rather, the challenge is offering resistance not to the tenets of this metaphysics, but to the authority and the ability of this metaphysics to disguise itself as physics. One may readily imagine, even if only in principle, an architecture that resists rather than enables the facile formal and spatial dichotomies that supplement the authority of this metaphysics. One can readily imagine an architecture that does not confirm or offer answers, but only questions. An architecture that does not arm, but disarms. An architecture that's neither and both as measured against the sides of any formal and spatial dichotomy. Imagining an architecture of resistance is not difficult. Architecture is, after all, merely a construct. It is not difficult to think through an architecture or an art museum that contextually resists docile dichotomies. Commitment to this architecture palpably is. The architecture that offers resistance will not be aesthetic. It may well be uncanny. However, the uncanny is, as Freud reminded us long ago, as homely as it is unhomely, and one can never know which. The inherent dilemmas of this architecture are not metaphysical or ideological. They are indelibly ethical.